I'm Sonia Usatch-Kuhn, your host. Welcome to Poets on Poetry. I will be speaking with members of the North Carolina Poetry Society, and we will be talking about the components involved in the process of writing poems. So, April is Poetry Month. And what better way to applaud poets than with my guest today, Joseph Bathanti, former North Carolina Poet Laureate from 2012 to 2014. Joseph lives with his wife, Joan, in Vilas, North Carolina. He has a graduate degree from the University of Pittsburgh and an MFA in creative writing from Warren Wilson College. Joseph is professor of English and McFarlane Family Distinguished Professor of Interdisciplinary Education and writer-in-residence of the Watauga Residential College at Appalachian State University. Joseph is the recipient of the North Carolina Award in Literature, the state's highest civilian honor. In his spare time, he's a runner, a reader, a Pittsburgh Steelers and Pirates aficionado, and an old-fashioned family man. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, please describe the process of becoming a poet laureate, and what did you accomplish in that position?
Okay. When the poet laureate seat is vacated, and that's always an indeterminate amount of time, what happens is historically there's a nomination process run by the North Carolina Arts Council. So anybody across the state can nominate anyone else. The idea here is that most of the people who get nominated have some foothold in the world of poetry. So that list is narrowed bit by bit by bit. I had been nominated before for the North Carolina Poet Laureate position, but it's something you never really bargain on getting because it's such an incredible honor. So I was nominated in 2012, and then I was notified that I was one of 3 finalists. How thrilling, how amazing. And then one day, I think it was July 13th, it was Friday the 13th, as a matter of fact, I was in a parking garage in Atlanta, Georgia, my wife's hometown, and I got a call from David Patorti, who was then the literature director at the North Carolina Arts Council. And David floored me by telling me that I had been chosen by Governor Beverly Perdue to be the 7th Poet Laureate in North Carolina's history. The most unexpected honor and also the very greatest honor of my life, I might add, in a thrill. So one thing that North Carolina Poets Laureate are asked to do is declare a signature project, Sonia, something apart from maybe the typical things that you'd be asked to do. A lot of school visits, we visit prisons, we visit domestic abuse shelters, lots of libraries, literary organizations, you name it, you name it. So apart from that typical service, we are asked to declare a signature project. And I said that I would work with returning combat veterans. This was 2012. We were in the absolute hideous throes of 2 wars, one in Afghanistan, one in Iraq. Young people were being deployed right and left, young men and women. So I said I would work with returning combat veterans, all veterans really, and their families to harvest their stories through poetry, fiction, personal essay, you name it. So because I said I was going to do that, I had to do that.
You had to.
I had, and I was passionate about doing it, but I might add, at that moment, I had only the most cursory experience working with veterans, especially combat veterans. I'm not a veteran. I very narrowly escaped the Vietnam War because the draft ended. I had a terrible draft lottery number. It was 33. I've always had a kind of residual guilt about that because so my thought is that the people who go to war so other people can stay home. And I was one of the people who ended up, grace of God, however you want to spin it, who didn't end up in Vietnam. So I launched into that work with a lot of advice from a lot of people. And then things really took on momentum, I believe it's in 2014. An extraordinary man named Bruce Kelly, a primary care physician at the Asheville VA hospital, the Charles George VA hospital in Asheville, had seen something that I had written about my work with veterans that was published in Our State magazine. So this fellow, Bruce, calls me, emails me out of the clear blue sky. It turns out that all along he's been modeling medical humanities programs up at the Asheville VA, and so many of his patients are Vietnam veterans, combat veterans with PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And Bruce is a kind of physician that gets deeply involved in his patients' stories. He doesn't just take blood and listen to, talk about blood pressure. And I think that's the trend in physicians now. I think they're very much more interested in medical humanities and people's entire stories. They're treating the whole person, whole health, which was not the case when I was a kid, let's say. But Bruce is one of those caring, dear, Gandhi-like individuals, and he asked me if I'd like to partner with him in this work. And I had already established a bit of a foothold. I was traveling all across North Carolina. You encounter veterans everywhere, in every nook and cranny, in the libraries, in social services, in the hospitals, in the grocery store. They just don't very often self-identify. So Bruce and I'm oversimplifying this story, Sonia.
Yes.
And it was
we don't have for 2 hours.
Yes, but it might be worth, you asked the question, so the answer might be worth
Okay.
It might be worth it. Anyhow, we co-founded a creative writing program at the Asheville VA, and I became the writer in residence for a year or a semester in 2016. And to make a long story short, although this is kind of the best news I can deliver to poets, I think, we saw those men's lives change in extraordinary ways through the power of the word. They were evangelized by writing in ways that drugs didn't help, and group therapy didn't help, and all the other placebos that they were kind of given, especially because they came back from that war very early on when we didn't have any language for PTSD. So that's what I did as Poet Laureate, and that work continues.
Commendable, very commendable. And I'm sure you got some terrific poetry out of those people that, came from the gut.
Yeah, remarkable. Yeah. They taught me much more than I could ever teach them, and they remain in my life.
So what attracted you to write poetry when you started to write poetry?
This could be a very banal story, to tell you the truth, Sonia. I was 16 years old in Pittsburgh, and the kinds of young women that I was attracted to liked poets. So predicated on that, I started writing poetry. That's more or less the truth. There was a high school literary magazine that came out called The Spectrum, and all the guys that had poems in it were just, they were getting a lot of reinforcement from all these girls I liked. So again, I thought I would start writing poetry, and it worked magic. But I should say, I'm being kind of facetious, but not entirely. It was also a time when boys, for the first time, were allowed to have feelings, were being
Yes.
asked to express themselves. I went to a very precocious high school, a life-changing high school, where I had teachers who were putting books in my hands, taking me to films, encouraging these boys to write. And so I started writing badly, as we all must, and I wrote less badly and less badly, and then became an English major in college and was completely evangelized by literature. And I wanted to take a crack at writing. And when I finally ended up in North Carolina, as a VISTA volunteer working in the prison system, I really began to develop the habit of actually writing and getting words down on paper rather than just being inspired but doing nothing with it.
So, continuing on that vein, let me ask you that when you write now and have, as you progressed, and now that you teach and have been teaching for a long time, what are the elements that you favor? Possibly theme, language, craft, or something else?
I mean, hopefully all of those things. I think that every poet has those things in mind. It's just we all have different styles. If I were to pinpoint a theme, and I'd probably call it more of an obsession than a theme in my work. It would be family. My parents are the children of Italian and French immigrants. My parents were working class people, steel worker and a seamstress. I'm the first person with my name to go to college. So I'm very intrigued with family, the fractures, the beauty, the mysteries. And so I'm obsessed with kind of writing, certainly about my family, but that's literature I gravitate towards. And I tend to be a narrative poet. A book that really I felt was life-changing for me was when I read Life Studies by Robert Lowell. It was published all the way back in 1959. Then it was groundbreaking. Now it would seem probably run-of-the-mill. I hope not, because I think Lowell's language still comes at you like, I don't know, body punches from Muhammad Ali as far as I'm concerned. But so I'm attracted to narrative, and I'm attracted to really compressed rat-a-tat-tat poems, to tell you the truth. I want to hear them. And I think the older you get, the more, maybe you're more meticulous about getting it right. I was in a much bigger rush than I am now. I'll work on a poem much longer. I was interested in getting a foothold and being published, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's the logical progression. Yeah, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. But now I am more interested in craft, and I've been teaching for so long too. So I'm teaching young poets who are just as impatient as I was then. Yeah. So it's a lot of fun, and it's also a lot of fun to turn them on to the vast smorgasbord buffet of poets that exists now that certainly didn't exist when I was, say, 23 years old and landed in North Carolina. The range of voices and diversity is breathtaking.
Voices. What thematically do the young people write about? Because in their songs, I don't understand what they're saying. But in their poetry, what are they saying? Well,
this crew of young poets, they're coming out of almost 2 years of Zoom education. They're coming out of live shooter drills, the hideous political landscape in which we live, climate anxiety, campaign against DEI and LGBTQ plus students. They feel very vulnerable. I encourage them to write about their lived lives. So I get a lot of poetry that comes from that space of, say, vulnerability, but I think baked into it is a kind of power too. They understand that they are the new voices, and that hopefully they understand too that they're a constituency. W.H. Auden said poetry doesn't change anything. I don't believe that at all. I think poetry does change so many things. One of North Carolina's great poets, my literary godfather, Ronald Bayes, said that the mere act of writing a poem is a political act. So they have a lot to say. It's very raw now, as it should be, but it's being, synthesized beautifully and distilled, and their voices are vibrant, and I hope people listen to them.
Well, I hope so. And I hope it helps them deal with whatever is sitting on their chest. Yeah. Well, let's see now. I do want to ask you to read some of your work. And I'm going to leave the choices up to you because you have 20 published books, so you have a lot to choose from.
I would love to read a poem or two, Sonia. You can just, I know time is of the essence always, but, I mentioned coming to North Carolina in 1976 as a Vista volunteer. I just gotten out of grad school at the University of Pittsburgh. I literally met the woman I've been married to for nearly 47 years at the round robin, introduce yourself at the table, Vista orientation in Atlanta, not incidentally in the ballroom where the ballroom scene where Gone with the Wind was filmed. So I'll read.
Wait a minute. Does Joan write?
Joan would say she doesn't write, but Joan's really a fine writer. Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
And just way more modest than I am, I think. So I'll read some poems about that era. So this one, as you see, I'm thinking about my wife. I just got nervous, nervous with love, of course. So this poem is called Certainty. Okay. Certainty. And there's only one thing you need to know, that the audience needs to know. There's a moment in this poem where a car that has been parked all night at the curb while the speaker and his friends are in a party, when they leave the party, the car is mysteriously coming down the street at them. So I just wanted to mention that because it's a juncture in the poem that it's kind of could be confusing. This takes place in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I lived initially and loved very much in 1976. And again, it's called Certainty. Far from home, penniless, food stamps, everything from Goodwill. I lived with Joan Carey, a Baptist girl from Tucker, Georgia. For $80, we leased a Charlotte attic across from Detox and Memorial Stadium and worked in the prisons. My family in Pittsburgh wondered what I was doing for no wage and why, all the way down in North Carolina, like some agitator. The certainty I lived in then made me happier than I've ever been. One torrid August night, 3 a.m., we barged out of a party. Joan and I and Jim, our Vista boss. We had come in Jim's tiny Honda. brown, homely tires the size of saucers. We were headed for Krispy Kreme up on Independence, the hot donuts, now neon, about to announce yet another epiphany in that enchanted tropical August. Joan was 20, sundresses, I remember like pets from my childhood, and Jim, so young and confident. Inside, they danced to Thelma Houston's Don't Leave Me This Way, setting fire to Hallelujah, the last sacrifice of summer, hearts and windows shattered across the Queen City. Glad to be together, we stepped into the street toward the car. The night was far from over, yet up in the huge magnolias, early morning cast its thermal hush upon the revel. The three of us saw it at the same time. Jim's Honda, somehow detached from its station at the curb, rolled down the middle of 8th Street. An automobile inexplicably animated with sinister purpose, as if we'd tripped unwittingly through the scrim, segregating us from that other world where things happen for no reason at all. Jim and I intercepted it, backpedaling as it pulled us toward the intersection until we finally halted it inches from catastrophe. We looked at one another and laughed the way convicts ambling Huntersville Yard laughed about building 30, 40 years in the penitentiary. Guys my age who wouldn't see the streets again until after the sons Joan and I would one day parent had grown into men and left home. The laugh Joan and I exchange all too often when the unimaginable hurtles into an otherwise placid day. The laugh I think of now is fear. And should I read another, Sonia? Do we have time for another?
Yes, and then we will ask you to read your love poem. I like to end the program with a little love.
Oh man, I just kind of read one, but I have a real.
I was going to say that, but I'm going to give you another opportunity.
I would love to read another love poem. Okay, very good. Goodness gracious sakes. Okay. This poem is called Teddy Bear. And it's about a guy that I knew at Huntersville Prison. And that was his nickname, Teddy Bear. And he was purportedly the toughest, baddest guy on the yard. But he and I were, I hesitate to say close, but very friendly. The inmates were all very nice to me because I didn't carry keys. I was just the guy coming in who would take them to play putt-putt, teach them creative writing, shoot hoops with them, do-gooder guy. So, yep. Teddy Bear. Hearing Harold Furr was the baddest man in Huntersville prison was a revelation. Pudgy. He had a beard that looped like a horseshoe ear to ear, Conway Twitty pompadour, and the mustache of a 13-year-old. Nicknamed Teddy Bear, he worked unit maintenance, smiling, round felon in green fatigues and tool belt, toting a ladder and can of WD-40. He looked like my school janitor. There's no real way to know what a man is like by looking at him. Baddest meant something, but I didn't know what it meant. How could I? Free man, school teacher, who knew when to lower his eyes and walk away. Still in my romantic way, I fancied myself a kind of outlaw when after class, Teddy and I sat and talked at the yard picnic tables as if the world had done me wrong too. To say he and I were friends is a stretch. We got along just fine, but I knew that if I so much as licked a stamp for him, he'd have me. Paroled, he rented a place, unbelievably, at the bottom of my street. Occasionally I'd spy him, shirt unbuttoned, on his big white belly, walking Freedom Drive home from his job at Gordy Tire. I'd stop and give him a lift. Things were going okay, nothing to it, he'd brag with a big hairy smile. I'd drop him at the little bungalow he was fixing up. He always shook my hand, told me I was good people and invited me to a standing Friday night poker game. Every Friday, I thought of showing up, becoming one of them, a man who could gut out anything, the jolt in prison, the hell kicked out of him, the grease and bust of working with his back for grub wages, chain smoking and drinking cheap beer and simmering danger, bluffing a whole table of ex-cons and bikers out of a jackpot. But in truth, I'm not such a man. Yet all my life, I've had to convince myself of this. Affronted or wounded, I plot revenge, but it's merely rhetorical. Mostly I brood. I would not cross my mind to shoot someone. I've never fired a gun of any sort. Teddy, on the other hand, must have offended the wrong person. It's particularly easy to accomplish. Bump a bet once too often, rat hole your winnings, pull up stakes prematurely. You might even good-heartedly remark at another's unusual luck, scrape a pot to your chest with too much relish. The list is endless and capricious. You're completely unaware that you've slighted anyone. People grin boozily, shake hands, and assure you they enjoyed it. They'll see you next Friday. But when you're asleep, they return, not merely in your dreams, but through the front door, and that's that. Convoy of screaming police cruisers, strobing blue the pre-dawn street, yellow vinyl crime tape winding around the pine trees in Teddy's front yard. So just a quick gloss on that. I was literally invited, and I love to play poker. I was literally invited to those poker games. And I'd say to Joan, my smart wife, I'm going down to play poker tonight. She'd say, don't go to play poker tonight. You don't go down there. And one night, Hell's Angels came in and completely slaughtered everybody in that house playing poker. It was a big thing in Charlotte. It massacred them. And, you know, my wife has saved my life in so many different ways, but quite literally, you know. So the moral of the story, everyone, is listen to your wife. So
no wonder you love her.
yeah, there's so many reasons, you know. But so I can end with a love poem.
A short one, not an epic.
Well, I don't know if I have a short one. Maybe yeah, I don't want to.
Let's say shorter than the prison time.
Okay, this one is shorter.
Okay.
Yeah. And
I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Sure.
It's Sweet Random. The first week on the project, the four of us knew vistas crashed at our boss's cramped flat. A Jewish girl from Bayonne, a Cuban whose preacher father was locked in Castro's Havana jail, a girl from Atlanta, and I, a Catholic from Pittsburgh, crammed together as we were, hot as fire. No air conditioning. At night, we drank outside, smoldering, as if on the brink of raising every prison in North Carolina. One day, after a long, fruitless search for my own place, the Atlanta girl, Joan Carey, emerged from the tiny bathroom, wrapped in a towel, chestnut hair pinned atop her head, into the full early evening sun blazing through the windows. The towel, buttery gold with wheat stalks and full blonde raiment, clouds of pale chaff, and the pollinated light of what would be another long, sultry August night in Charlotte. She and I, up to that point, had been friendly, even circumspectly affectionate. Dazed by the sight of her, nothing but a towel, the sun stealing over us, I knew little of her, perhaps less of myself, purely nothing of the lives of caged men. I envisioned prison as purgatory, a colossal furnace hoarding chits on me. Above all, so help me God, I felt blessed by those shackled men pulling my time in the forge, forsaking home for toil among convicts. It had been rectitude I desired, an apparition bare and reckoning as an angel with a flaming sword. Ahead of me beckoned sweet random. All night I held it seared against me.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And I try to have a quote that speaks to the poet who's been speaking to me. And I don't know Michael Franti. I don't know if you know him, However, because of all your soul work with all the prisoners, and here's the quote, every single soul is a poem.
That's beautiful. Thank you,
Okay.
Sonia. Yeah, I'm glad that you read that.
So I want to thank you for being such a warm guest, and congratulations on your induction into the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame this coming October 2024.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sonia. And to just all the people listening to the North Carolina Poetry Society has been so kind to me over the years. Thanks to all of you. My pleasure.
And I thank them too for having such a wonderful selection of guests to come on Poets on Poetry. You've been listening to Poets on Poetry. This is Sonia Usatch-Kuhn, Rashan Media, Peter Rashan, producer.